How different are the Saints and how different are the Eagles over the last 8 weeks?
Well, definitely from the Eagles' perspective, they're a very much improved team. I mean, you can argue that was their rock bottom. Can't argue it. It was certainly a 48-7 game. It's basically been a playoff-level atmosphere. They felt they needed to win every game. They've won every game except the overtime loss in Dallas. So they're a much better football team. And the Saints have taken a step back, at least as far as explosiveness goes. Their offense, which was scoring at such a high clip, scored over 40 points 6 times, I think, not been able to reach that number since. So it's hard to say the Saints aren't playing well with their record and the number 1 seed, but they've been going about it a little bit differently. And I think, both sides kind of know whoever wins this game, it's not going to be 48-7 this time.
No, and some of the things. So you mentioned the Saints are not as explosive. What are some of the reasons behind them? Now, one of the reasons they were so explosive against the Eagles, John, is not there anymore. Chandon, Sullivan, Devontae, Bosby. That'll make a lot of teams explosive.
Yeah, I mean, that's part of it. The Eagles had such injury issues in the secondary to begin with coming into that game, and then you lose corners in game, and you're left playing guys that aren't even on the roster now. So that's certainly part of it, and the fact that we've seen how in many teams, not just the Eagles, but if you have a number of key injuries at a particular position, you can't do anything. The most notable example of that would be Washington and their offensive line first, and then their quarterback issues. They turned from a potential playoff team into a team that couldn't move the football at all with Josh Johnson. So injuries have a big impact on this game. The Eagles have come in a much better situation from a secondary standpoint. And then I think people have kind of figured out, I don't want to say figured them out to the point where it's easy to handle that Saints offense, because nothing could be further from the truth. But people have kind of realized you need to shut down Michael Thomas. You need to shut down Alvin Kamara as best as possible and force the other guys to beat you. And, hey, Mark Ingram's a good player. Ted Ginn is back, and he can hurt you. But you can see, just look at their stats, Mike, and you see the huge drop-off in the passing game from Michael Thomas and Kamara down to the third receiver. They just don't have that other option.
Right. Well, somebody had texted in earlier, John, that Taquan Smith had 10 catches, 157. He burned the Eagles last time. What's Ted Ginn going to do? He'll be back for the game. And, he's a veteran guy with a lot of speed. Number one, I said, well, Smith had 13 targets and 10 catches. If he duplicates that again, the Eagles ain't winning the game. But how about that?
Again, he's doing it against Chandon Sullivan and Devontae Bosby, as opposed to not that Rasul Douglas and Avonte Maddox are top-tier cornerbacks, but they have improved. They have been playing well. People will point to the second half and Avonte getting hit on those double moves, but I think he's a smart player. He'll learn from that. And then Cre'Von LeBlanc. I mean, Jim Schwartz went on record and said that probably saved the season. Think about that for the Eagles, picking up Cre'Von LeBlanc off waivers from the Detroit Lions, and Jim Schwartz says it saved their season.
Yeah. John McMullen here on the Boardwalk Honda Hotline. I know, John, we got to you late. Maybe we can reconvene in the next hour and get an elongated conversation here. But a couple of things. I talked about 8 weeks ago how things were so different. The Eagles kind of hit rock bottom. Their season looked like it was done. The Saints had really been at the top of the mountain. It looked like they were going to be cruising. Here we are 8 weeks later. I think you could say the Eagles are significantly a different team. And a lot of the reasons they're a different team is because of the health of that defense. And guys, 8 weeks in their progression of their roles. As we mentioned, Cre'Von LeBlanc was here for the first game at that point. Here he is 8 weeks later, and Jim Schwartz is talking about how he has saved the defense. Things like that. I think Jernigan being back, has been a big help. He hasn't done a whole heck of a lot, but having his presence on first and second downs, if you're going to pass, that's a guy who can get some pass rush up the middle that they didn't have in that first game. So there's a lot of intricacies for the Eagles 8 weeks down the road that are different.
Yeah, and on both sides of the football, you mentioned all the defensive parts moving, and you're certainly right about the secondary and
Darren Sproles
being back. Darren Sproles offensively, and also the offensive line. The offensive line is healthy, and they are again playing like a top 5 offensive line in this league. And when you have that kind of offensive line, you could beat anybody because it's very difficult if you don't get a good pass rush to play pass defense in this league. And you saw that offensive line against the best defensive front in football in Chicago. You saw what they were able to do, and it really dates back to the Rams game when this sort of kicked off with Nick Foles and Darren Sproles and this offensive line. Think about Aaron Donald. Then the next week it was J.J. Watt and Jadeveon Clowney. Then the next week it was Ryan Kerrigan. Then it was Khalil Mack. All these great pass rushers, and they're not sniffing the quarterback.
Right. I was going to ask you, where is this Saints defense next to Chicago, next to Houston, L.A.? I mean, L.A., I think, was an overrated defense, but they had Donald, they got Talib. They've got star-level players, but not a great defense as a whole. And they were banged up, too, the L.A. defense, but just not a tough defense. But
I would say it's nowhere near Chicago. But none of them are. And then it's a tick down from Houston. I mean, obviously the strength of the Saints is on the other side of the football.
Which is odd because I think, John, last year the Saints got to where they got. Surprisingly, I think last year they were a little bit of a surprise. They went on that 10-game winning streak. But I think that was because their defense. I think people were surprised by how good their defense got last year.
Well, it was much improved compared to where it was. I mean, it was historically bad for a number of years, and then they got a lot better a lot quickly. But and they do have some real talent up front, especially with Cam Jordan and Sheldon Rankins, who's a very good player. But you can still throw the football on them, and they struggle in pass defense at times. Marshawn Lattimore's taken a bit of a step back this year. Eli Apple, they made the trade for him. He's had his issues both with the Giants and down there. So you can throw the football against them. They're very low in pass defense rankings. And that's how you have to attack them. I think if you're projecting the Eagles to win this football game, it's not going to be 16-15. It's going to be 34-31, 37-34, something of that range. You're going to have to beat them in a shootout. And I think the Eagles are capable of getting into a shootout and scoring some points against this defense.
John McMullen, 97.3 ESPN.com. John McMullen joins us every day at 4 o'clock on the Boardwalk Honda hotline, but we were having some phone issues that we've got fixed now. But I wanted to have some more of an NFL conversation, some more Eagles and Saints here. So we're bringing John back in here in the 5 o'clock hour to kind of talk more about this game. And obviously it's a big game. There's a lot on the line here. We've been getting flooded with text messages today with questions. So if you have questions that you want answered for John, we will put out the text message now, 609-403-0973. We were talking about this, John, like if, people are debating with their buddies, like friends are just having a conversation about this game. What is like the back and forth debate? Let me ask you this question here. If you were to say how, back 8 weeks ago, we would say the Saints were significantly better than the Eagles. Do you think 8 weeks later that the Saints are significantly better, a significantly better roster than Philadelphia now?
Well, it depends what your definition is, but I would say they're clearly a better team. This is the number 1 seed. They deserve, obviously, where they are. They're a 9-point favorite, depending where you look. So that's pretty significant. But it wouldn't shock me if the Eagles pulled off the upset. And I kind of mentioned that in the 4 o'clock hour. The main reason for me is the offensive line, because I think you can win any game in this league if you have a dominant offensive line and they bring their A game. The Eagles have that capability, and they're a little bit different than what they were 7 weeks ago, because they have sort of secured some of those deficiencies and improved themselves on the defensive side of the football to the point where they're not great by any stretch of the imagination, but they could at least hold up a little bit better. And all of a sudden, you could see both sides dragging it into a closer game. And if you're in a close game, hey, whether it's a double doink or a bounce of the football, anything can go if it's a one-score game in the fourth quarter. And I think that's the Eagles' hope.
John, Jeffrey, I want to get your take on his role in this offense against this team. Can he be utilized better? The last time, Wentz was the quarterback the last time he played. He played maybe the worst game as a pro in that game, right? And I know that people have the perception that Foles throws the ball more to Jeffrey. Now, I think it was maybe crossing broad. Somebody over there broke down the numbers that Wentz actually throws the ball more to Jeffrey than Foles does, but they throw the ball to him differently.
Yeah, I think the difference is Nick is more willing to give him the opportunities on those 50-50 balls. From a pure traffic perspective, there is barely any difference. In fact, as you mentioned, Carson throws into him a little bit more statistically. Where I think the difference is, and this comes from, I think, being more of the veteran guy and his ability. That's what the NFL is. At times, you have to give your playmakers an opportunity to make plays even when they're not open. And that's one of Alshon Jeffrey's strengths as a player, and the fact that if you give him an opportunity to make a play on those 50-50 balls, if he's not going to make that play, he's going to make sure it's broken up, so nothing bad is going to happen. And Nick just is more willing to pull the trigger on that. And maybe Carson, as he gets a little bit further into his career, becomes more comfortable in that, rather than just waiting for the open receiver.
Yeah, and then also Agholor. I was looking back through the box score from the first game. He had nothing in that game. How has Agholor's role changed, do you think, in the last couple of weeks? And I don't know if that's Foles or what, but how do you see Agholor? Is he being used differently? Is Foles just utilizing him better? What is your Agholor reasoning why he – and I say this a lot, John, his numbers weren't great last year. He just made plays. He was in the right place at the right time and made plays. Even the last week, he caught that ball. When he catches the ball and has room to run, he can run. I mean, he's got some straight line speed. You talk about it a lot. He's got speed, but doesn't track the ball all that well. But when he catches it and can turn up the field, he can motor.
Yeah, he can make plays with his athleticism, and he's certainly the most athletic receiver on this team. The problem is the consistency is not there from catching the football from that standpoint, and that's obviously big. From a receiver's perspective. So it's difficult to sort of trust him from week to week to where he's going to be the top option in the game plan. And the Eagles are lucky enough to have guys where he doesn't have to be. So I think a lot of it is how is Nelson playing on a particular game day, whether it's Carson Wentz or Nick Foles, to be honest. Sometimes he's just not feeling it. He's just not confident. And Doug Peterson has said time and time again, when he and Mike Rowe sit down the game plan, the top two, from a passing perspective, the top two are always 17 and 86, and that's Alshon Jeffrey and Zach Ertz. Nothing changes from Carson and Nick or vice versa. And Nelson's in that next group. So I think it becomes game plan specific, whether you want to get the football, whether you think you can get the football to Nelson Agholor or Dallas Goedert or Golden Tate. I think that becomes sort of game plan specific on how you think you can attack a particular defense.
Yeah, and John, Tate played in that game. It was one of his first game. He had 5 catches for like 50 yards, but I don't know if he has a role or not. But what are you seeing? What is Tate at this stage? I don't know that he's going to continue to get better or be added more. How do you see Tate, and how do you see him in this matchup as opposed to the last time?
Well, he's the third receiver. He's pretty much in that, and so a lot of it depends on how the Eagles go about it. Are they going to play a lot of 11 personnel, or are they going to play a lot of 12 personnel? At the end of the regular season, they were playing a lot of 2 tight ends, more than 3 receivers, and you saw his numbers suffer because he wasn't on the field as much. Against the Bears, they felt, for whatever reason, they needed to play more 11 personnel, and they used the 3 receivers, and his numbers picked up a little bit. So that's where I talked about that game plan specific stuff, and that's where Nelson's involved and Dallas Goedert is involved, and it's sort of the secondary receivers behind the guys that are going to be in it, which is Alshon Jeffrey and Zach Ertz.
John, Ertz, 2 catches, 15 yards last game. Most of the time with Wentz, he had big games. That was a game where it seemed that the Saints were doubling him and making sure that he wasn't going to be a factor. With Wentz out, I wonder if they defend him the same way.
Well, look, it's difficult to defend Zach Ertz for anybody, and he's the Eagles' top receiver. So whether we talk about wideouts or tight ends or who's going to get the football, as I mentioned, the Eagles kind of understand that Zach Ertz is their guy. Now, anybody in this league, and Bill Belichick is famous for this, you can take somebody out if you want to. You can bracket them. You could use 3 players. In the days of sort of guys like Randy Moss, teams would use literally 3 players to bracket him. And from the Eagles' perspective, if somebody is taking Zach Ertz out of the game, that's where other guys have to step up and make plays, and they're getting opportunities and man-to-man coverage and not getting a lot of attention. So Doug talks all the time about what is the defense giving you, and a lot of that is what Nick Foles has been so effective at, and Doug always talks about the point guard mentality, and Nick's past as a basketball player, and he's very comfortable distributing the football, no matter who it is, no matter who's open. And that, think about it, Mike, that 4th down play, and Golden Tate didn't run the right route and didn't understand what was going on. But that tells you Nick Foles. A lot of people would force the football in that situation to your best alternative, whether it's Zach Ertz or Alshon Jeffrey. He was going to get the football to who he thought was open, who he thought had the best opportunity for the defense that was out there. And that's really where Nick Foles has been most effective.
Yeah, and John, you mentioned the last hour about the offensive line and the Eagles' offensive line and how much better they are. They've dominated Aaron Donald, J.J. Watt, Khalil Mack. I mean, Cam Jordan's pretty good. He's not on that level, and that's an area where I think that the Eagles feel much better this time around than they did 8 weeks ago.
Yeah, it's been pretty amazing. And I seem like I've been talking about it all year because people were all over this offensive line earlier in the season. And don't get me wrong, they're playing better than they were. But even at their bottom, sort of, when they were struggling the most, it was still top 10 when you looked at the rest of this league. It's just a really, really talented group. If you look at Pro Football Focus, for instance, they have 3 of the top 25 offensive linemen in the league. And that's not including Jason Peters, who's sort of when he's tested, and you saw it against Khalil Mack, he might be 36 years old. But if you challenge Jason Peters, he can still play at that Hall of Fame level. It's just a really good group. and Isaac Seumalo was sort of the weak link. And you saw him and his athleticism and his strength and his size. They have all pro level players at three different positions. And then you have Jason Peters, who's, as I said, going to the Hall of Fame. It's just really, really good. And when they're playing like they're playing now, they can beat anybody. And you mentioned it goes back to that Rams game and Aaron Donald and Ndamukong Suh. Then it was J.J. Watt and Jadeveon Clowney. Then it was Ryan Kerrigan. Then it was Khalil Mack and Akeem Hicks and Leonard Floyd. They can block anybody. It doesn't get better than the Bears, and they blocked them.
Yeah.
And when you have that luxury where you know your offensive line is going to block the opposing defense, you have a chance to win the game.
John, last week they couldn't run the ball against the Bears. The Bears have a very good run defense, so the run game was kind of, they tried it. I'll give them some credit. They didn't, completely get rid of it, which I like. I don't care if you have 10 carries for 20 yards. Just show me you're going to do it so that the defense, and that's kind of what they did, and they had a couple of, moments in the game. But in the game against the Saints, they should be able to have a more success in that aspect of the game.
Yeah, I mean, and I kind of said, look, they're not going to be able to run the ball against Chicago, and that turned out to be true because they are that good defending the run. But the second part of it is people have to be honest about this situation. When you look at the team, and I just mentioned they have a great offensive line, and you say, well, they should be able to run the football. Well, the problem is they're not very good at running back. They're just not. And you're talking about an undrafted guy, Josh Adams, who's been the bell cow down the stretch of the regular season.
Who, by the way, barely played at all.
No, yeah, he was benched against the Bears, played one play.
Why was that?
Because they weren't confident. They didn't want a rookie in there against that defense. They didn't want the potential of a fumble to turn that game around. So they went with more of the veteran setup in Wendell Smallwood and Darren Sproles. And I've kind of told you that if they keep this thing going and continue to go and make the playoffs and get through the first game, which is they have now, they're going to go more and more and more to Darren Sproles and default to him. And he's 35 years old. And even in his prime, because of the size issues, he's not a guy who can touch it 25 or 30 times.
No, but at this stage of the season, though, you could pump those numbers up a little bit.
Well, no, and that's what they're doing. And that's what he's playing the most, and that will continue, and they'll trust him the most.
Yeah.
But if you're looking at this team, this roster as a whole, and you said, well, where's this team good? It starts with the offensive, defensive line. Where's this team not very good? It's running back, it's cornerback, and you got to be honest about that.
Yeah. Well, I think the Eagles' offense, forget Wentz and Foles, I just think it's more complete. Is that fair to say than it was 8 weeks ago?
Oh, no question. And I think it has more to do. Look, Nick deserves credit. He's playing very well. He's a big part of that. But there's also more to it. And part of it is Sproles getting healthy and being part of the offense. Part of it is the offensive line getting healthy and performing at the level we saw during the Super Bowl season. So all of that has sort of happened at one time. But Nick is a big part of that as well. And his production on third and fourth downs has been unbelievable. So when you talk about situational football and where you really win football games, the guts of any game, so to speak, Nick Foles has just performed on third and fourth down at such a high level.
Right.
But even that, there are parts to that is they've been more effective on first and second down. So if you have a manageable third or fourth down situation versus third and 12 or third and 13, that contributes to that as well.
And you wrote about the secret to Nick Foles' success on third down. I think last year that was one of the secrets to Carson Wentz's success, right? Like they were a great third down team, and this year they were not a great third down team with Carson, but that has changed.
Yeah, it has, and part of it is, one of the things they're doing is not shooting themselves in the foot now, and their ability to stay in front of the sticks, which is coaches always talk about. It's so important that you don't put yourself in bad situations, and it's hard to convert in this league consistently. You might do it occasionally and pick up a 3rd and 12 or 3rd and 13. But if you have to do that a lot in a particular game, things are not going to go very well for you. So,
well, that was the thing last week, John. They were picking up 3rd and 10s and 3rd and longs in this game last week against this Bears defense. I mean, you're thinking 3rd and 10 against the Bears, and they converted a handful of those 3rd and longs against them.
Well, yeah, I mean, and that's the thing. But you're not going to do it consistently, and you're certainly not going to do it consistently from week to week. It helps when you are able to pass, protect, and guys are able to hold up on the edges like Lane Johnson and Jason Peters and give receivers an opportunity to run those routes that take a long time to develop. But no matter how good you are, you can't do that in this league consistently.
Right.
And the Eagles have been really a lot better at staying out of those situations. Remember, that Bears game, look, they won the game. They won a game against what I think is the best defense in the NFL. But also understand they only scored 16 points. So that wasn't the game to point out, look, we're doing great offensively. Just they were able to hold up and not implode against that kind of defense.
I do want to look at the Eagles' defense, and I want to look at their defensive front and the line of the Saints. And, people, this has been kind of not talked about a lot, but they've, kind of flatlined offensively a little bit, and they've had some injuries on that offensive line. And that, hasn't – I don't know that it's been talked about as much because they've won, and they've won kind of going away in terms of the division, 13-3. They've had a great season. But I think the offensive line of the Saints is something that should be looked at.
Well, it was really, really good for the first half of the season. And one of the reasons why is because we talk about the tackles here. Well, they got tackles like that as well in Teron Armstead and Ryan Ramczyk. And even, Lane Johnson, when he talked about being snubbed in the Pro Bowl, mentioned Ramczyk and Mitchell Schwartz as right tackles, who sort of get overlooked because everyone talks about left tackles. But when Armstead went down, he was the best left tackle in football for the first 8 games of the season. And that underappreciated part of the Saints' effectiveness on offense was how good that offensive line was. Everybody talked about Drew Brees, and everybody understands why. And everybody talked about Michael Thomas and Alvin Kamara. But that offensive line was really, really good as well. And that's part of the issue you have to deal with that team.
Kamara, give me I think the last time they played, you were mentioning how you think he might be the most explosive, best weapon in the league. They did okay with him. I mean, the game was kind of out of hand, so they didn't have to use him. I think he had like 70 yards rushing. I don't remember him out of the backfield and what he did that game because Smith just blitzed you all game long. But how do the Eagles, how do they kind of focus on him this game?
Well, I think you kind of saw it. It's interesting because they just came off a game against the Bears, who have a similar player, not as good, not quite as dynamic, but Tariq Cohen is their best offensive player, Chicago. And the Eagles did a very good job taking him out of the game. The way they did it was they played a ton of what the Eagles call big nickel, what other people would call a dime defense, where they have 6 defensive backs on the field. I don't know if they can do that against the Saints, however, because if you do that against the Saints, all of a sudden you might have Mark Ingram running for 125, 140. Now, you could say the Bears, they did a tremendous job on Jordan Howard. But again, this is different. The Saints have a better offensive line. Mark Ingram's better than Jordan Howard. And Kamara himself is a better runner than Tariq Cohen is a runner. So I don't know if he can play, just say big nickel. Malcolm Jenkins is going to play linebacker, and we're going to mix up Malcolm Jenkins, Nigel Bradham, Cre'Von LeBlanc on Alvin Kamara. That's what the Eagles will try to do. I'm not sure if it works as well against that player, but we'll see. That's one of the matchups, and that's what makes the Saints so difficult. Yeah. And then you have the quarterback. I mean, Drew Brees is a heck of a lot different than Mitchell Trubisky. So, a lot of times you can stop great players because the quarterback isn't that good. Well, that's not the case this week.
Well, and John, I talked about earlier before you came back on, which was Rasul Douglas and Maddox. Now Douglas played the last time, and he did not have a good game. I think that was he was part of that group that just didn't know what the hell was going on back there, where Malcolm Jenkins said, hey, look, we need to simplify things for these guys. And I think that's helped a guy like Douglas, where Douglas is a guy who at West Virginia, his rookie year, and even this year, he's a guy who's around the ball. He makes plays. He might not be the fastest guy. You might be able to run past him, but he tackles you, and he's a ball hawk. Maddox is a tough guy. He tackles you. So did they let Michael Thomas and this Saints team catch the ball underneath? Because one of the problems they had the first time, they didn't tackle anybody. LeBlanc and Sullivan, those guys couldn't tackle you or me. I'm not just putting you in that role, but they couldn't tackle. These guys tackle much better than Chandon Sullivan and Devontae Bosby would. So is the role, let these guys catch the ball in front of us, and we believe that we're going to tackle you this time?
Yeah, I mean, you look at Rasul Douglas especially, and you're right, he's a ball hawk, and he's got tremendous ball skills for a corner. He's a really big corner. He's a really physical corner, and he can tackle. The second part is, though, he's gained so much confidence in himself since that game, since the first time against the Saints.
Yeah.
And I always point back to that first game against the Redskins. I point to that one play where the Redskins were in desperate straits because Colt McCoy got hurt. They had to go to Mark Sanchez. They couldn't do anything. And they tried that trick play, which was a throwback to Chris Thompson across the field. And they had it set up perfectly. Mm-hmm. It was going to be a 40-yard gain at least. It might have been a touchdown. They had Trent Williams out in front, the big left tackle, all pro. One guy could make the play, and it was Rasul Douglas, and he made the play, sort of undercut Trent Williams, made this great tackle. And ever since that moment, he's sort of gained confidence in himself, and he's been a much better player. He's never going to be a great press coverage guy because he doesn't have tremendous speed for a cornerback in this league. But he does have a lot of traits you can build on, and one of them is physicality, and he can be great in run support, and he's been a great tackler since pretty much that week against the Redskins. And the Eagles, they kind of stumbled into Avonte Maddox. They really did. They pigeonholed him like a lot of teams do in this league, and you look at him and say, well, he's a slot corner because he's too short, he's too small, he can't play outside. And the Eagles only put him there because they had to.
Right.
And he's played great.
And it's worked out.
He's played great.
Yeah.
Except for the second half against the Bears. He was not great.
Well, and I wonder if the Saints kind of, take a look at that and figure out ways to kind of go after him. And conversely, I do want to ask this question real quick. We're coming up short on time here, but if there's things that the Eagles might take from the Dallas game, and Carolina really gave them problems, the game down in Carolina, if you watch those two tapes and say some things that gave New Orleans some problems in those games.
Yeah, and I said, I mean, you pretty much try to stop Michael Thomas and Alvin Kamara and make somebody else beat you. Now, that's it's to simplify it as much as possible. That's what it is. And they have guys. It's gotten a little bit better because Ted Ginn is back, and I mentioned Ingram. They have other guys, but you don't want Michael Thomas and Alvin Kamara going nuts. If that happens, you're in for a long afternoon. And the best you can hope for is to try to limit those guys as much as possible and force other guys to beat you. And it's easier said than done, especially in the Superdome, because they're a lot better in the Superdome than they are outside of it. Everybody's better on their home field, but them specifically, especially offensively, they're really, really tough to deal with in that environment.
John McMullen, 97.3 ESPN.com. Check out all of his Eagles coverage for Eagles and Saints right now. And don't forget, follow him on Twitter at JFMcMullen. I guarantee he will respond to you. I guarantee it. John, thanks, pal.
Unless you're a troll, I will not respond to you.
Even the trolls, you'll respond to them until you figure out they're a troll.
Exactly. And then you're blocked or muted.
There you go.
If you haven't figured that out yet.
All right, man. Take care.
All right. Thanks, Mike.